The racist bank manager thought he could humiliate an elderly black woman, denying her access to her own money. The smirk on his face said he had done this before, without consequence. But today wasn't just another day. Today, her son was watching. And when that son is Shaquille O'Neal, the whole world is about to watch too. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning sun cast long shadows over the quiet streets of Newark, New Jersey. It was the kind of morning that carried a deceptive calm, where life moved at its usual pace, unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Shaquille O'Neal, despite his towering presence, blended seamlessly into the rhythm of his hometown. Dressed in a simple hoodie and jeans, he walked down the familiar streets, nodding to the old-timers sitting on their porches and exchanging easy smiles with shopkeepers who had known him since he was just little Shaquille. Shaq never let his wealth or fame create distance between him and his roots. He was still the same kid who grew up playing ball at the local court, the same son who called his mother every morning, no matter how busy life got. His mother, Lucille O'Neal, had always been his grounding force. Her lessons of humility, respect, and standing up for others were embedded in his soul. And it was those lessons that pulled him back home, reminding him that no matter how far he had come, his true success lay in never forgetting where he started. As he strolled down the block, his phone buzzed. It was his mother. "Morning, Ma," he answered with a grin. "Morning, baby. You get in okay?" "Yeah, just walking around, soaking it all in." He took a deep breath, the crisp air filling his lungs. "Feels good to be home." Lucille chuckled. "Don't forget to stop by the community center. The kids still talk about the last time you came." Shaq smiled. "You know I wouldn't miss it." Before they hung up, her voice softened. "Keep your eyes open, Shaquille. The world still ain't as fair as it should be." He knew what she meant. The world had changed, but in many ways it hadn't changed enough. Some battles, like the ones his mother had fought in her time, were still being fought today. And as much as he wanted to believe in the goodness of people, experience had taught him to stay alert. Further down the street, a small-town bank sat nestled between a barber shop and a bakery, its glass doors reflecting the morning light. Inside, customers moved about their business, chatting idly, filling out forms, waiting in quiet patience. Among them was an elderly black woman, Martha Williams, dressed in a neatly pressed dress, her silver hair pulled into a dignified bun. She carried herself with the quiet grace of someone who had seen decades of change, yet she still held her head high. She stepped up to the counter, her purse clutched firmly in her hands, and smiled at the young teller behind the glass. "Good morning, dear. I'd like to make a withdrawal." Before the teller could respond, a sharp voice cut through the room. Martha Williams. The voice belonged to Richard Caldwell, the bank's manager. He was a middle-aged man with slicked-back hair, a stiff suit, and the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. He leaned against the counter with an air of forced politeness, his gaze cold and assessing. Martha turned to him, her smile unwavering. "Good morning, Mr. Caldwell." Richard didn't return the greeting. Instead, he glanced at the slip in her hand and frowned. "This is quite a large withdrawal. Are you sure you have the right account?" Martha's fingers tightened around her purse. "I've been banking here for over 20 years, Mr. Caldwell." "That may be," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "But procedures are procedures. We have to be careful with situations like these." Shaq, who had just stepped inside the bank, paused mid-step. His eyes flicked toward the conversation, his ears catching the subtle edge in Richard's voice. He recognized that tone. It was the same one he had heard too many times growing up, the one that dripped with doubt, that questioned dignity, that made a person feel small. He moved closer, keeping his distance but listening intently. Martha straightened her back. "I have my identification." Richard sighed theatrically. "That's not the issue, Mrs. Williams. It's just unusual, you understand. Someone in your position withdrawing this amount of money." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "And what position is that?" Richard gave a slow, insincere smile. "Let's just say we have to be extra cautious, for security reasons." The room had gone silent. The other customers avoided eye contact, shifting uncomfortably. The bank tellers exchanged nervous glances, but said nothing. Shaq's jaw tightened. He had seen this before, the kind of humiliation that wasn't outright aggression, but was just as damaging. He could feel the tension in Martha's posture, the way her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer exhaustion of having to prove herself over and over again. Richard leaned in, lowering his voice just enough for the words to sting. Perhaps if you had someone with more financial literacy to assist you, we could move this along quicker. Martha's eyes flashed with something fierce. I know how to handle my own money, Mr. Caldwell. Richard's smile turned into a smirk. Of course you do. But you understand, I have to protect the bank's interests. Shaq had heard enough. He took a step forward, his towering presence impossible to ignore. Excuse me, he said, his voice calm but firm. Richard turned, irritated at being interrupted. But the moment he laid eyes on Shaq, his expression shifted. For a fraction of a second, he hesitated, just long enough for Shaq to see the flicker of recognition. But then, just as quickly, Richard's mask of arrogance slid back into place. Yes, can I help you? Shaq crossed his arms, his eyes locked onto Richard's. Yeah, I think you can. The room was deathly quiet now. Everyone was watching. The tellers, the customers, even the security guard by the door. The air was thick with anticipation, with the unspoken question hanging between them. Did Richard realize who he was talking to? And even if he did, would it change anything? Shaq didn't introduce himself. He didn't need to. Instead, he gestured toward Martha. I was just wondering why a loyal customer is being treated like a criminal for wanting to withdraw her own money. Richard let out a short, forced chuckle. This is just standard procedure, sir. Nothing personal. Shaq arched an eyebrow. Nothing personal? His voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable weight behind it. Because from where I'm standing, it sure looks personal. Richard opened his mouth to respond, but something in Shaq's gaze made him pause. The room was still watching, waiting. Shaq didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He just let the silence stretch, forcing Richard to sit in his own discomfort. Martha turned to Shaq, her eyes filled with quiet gratitude. She hadn't asked for help, but she wasn't about to refuse it either. And in that moment, something shifted. Shaq wasn't just a silent observer anymore. He was part of this now. The air inside the bank had grown thick, not with the warmth of familiarity, but with an unspoken tension that clung to the walls like stale perfume. Martha Williams, standing with quiet dignity at the counter, had felt this sensation before. It was the kind of weight that pressed down on people like her, the kind that made simple tasks feel like battles. But Martha had lived long enough to know that battles weren't always fought with fists. Some were fought with patience, with resilience, with the unwavering belief that she had just as much right to be here as anyone else. She adjusted her purse strap and handed her withdrawal slip to the teller, a young woman named Lisa, whose hesitant smile flickered like a candle in the wind. Lisa had been working at this bank for nearly a year, and she had seen this happen before. She took the slip, eyes darting toward Richard Caldwell's office window, as if bracing for the inevitable. Martha waited, standing tall despite the way her knees ached. She wasn't here to cause trouble. She wasn't here for charity. She was here for her own money, the same money she had deposited for years without issue. The door to the manager's office creaked open, and Richard Caldwell stepped out, straightening his already perfect tie. His gaze swept across the bank, landing on Martha with thinly veiled irritation. He wasn't a man who yelled. He didn't need to. His authority came in the form of thin smiles, calculated pauses, and words dipped in condescension. Lisa barely had time to process the request before Richard's voice cut through the air like a blade. Martha Williams, he said, his tone far too formal for someone who had known her for years. Is there a problem? Martha turned, offering him a polite but firm nod. No problem at all, Mr. Caldwell. Just here to withdraw some money. Richard took the slip from Lisa's hesitant fingers and examined it with exaggerated scrutiny. His eyes flickered toward Martha, and then, ever so slightly, his lips curled into something that resembled amusement. This is quite a large amount, he said, just loud enough for the nearby customers to hear. Martha's spine stiffened. "It's my money, Mr. Caldwell." Richard exhaled a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. Of course. But you understand, in situations like these, we have to be extra careful." A few customers turned, pretending not to listen while doing exactly that. Martha could feel the weight of their glances, the judgment in their silence. "Situations like these," she repeated, her voice calm but pointed. Richard's smirk didn't falter. "Large withdrawals, unusual activity, fraud prevention and all that." Martha folded her hands in front of her, a habit she had developed long ago when dealing with men like him. "Mr. Caldwell, I have been banking here for over 2 decades. I've withdrawn money before without an issue. Why is today different?" Richard sighed, loud and performative. "It's not different, Martha. It's just policy. Can't be too careful these days, you understand." The words dripped with implication, and the room felt it. Lisa looked away, gripping the edge of the counter. The security guard near the door shifted uncomfortably. A man in a suit checking his phone suddenly found it harder to focus. Martha inhaled deeply. She had expected this, but that didn't make it easier. "I have my identification," she said, voice steady. "My bank statements, whatever you need." Richard tilted his head, feigning thoughtfulness. "Well, even with ID, it's about financial stability, you see. These things can be tricky." Martha blinked. "Financial stability?" Richard nodded, turning the withdrawal slip toward her as if it were evidence in a trial. "You've been making smaller deposits, but now you're withdrawing a significant sum. That's a bit unusual, don't you think?" Martha's lips pressed together. "I have bills to pay." Richard's smirk widened. "Don't we all?" The humiliation settled in her stomach like a stone. He wasn't denying her outright. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he was stringing her along, making her jump through hoops, making her feel small in a place where she had every right to stand tall. And worse, he was making a spectacle of it. The bank tellers remained silent. The customers exchanged glances but said nothing. The complicity in their silence was deafening. Martha exhaled slowly. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction of anger. "Are you going to process my request or not?" Richard tapped the counter twice, a casual dismissal. "Tell you what, Martha. Let's take a few days to review your account activity, just to be safe." The words hit her like a slap. A few days? This wasn't a delay. This was a refusal without saying the word. She straightened her shoulders, forcing steel into her voice. "I need my money today." Richard's expression flickered, just for a second, before settling back into false patience. "And I need to protect this bank from liability. Surely you understand." A soft chuckle rose from somewhere in the room. Not loud, not obvious, but enough. Someone was enjoying this. And that was when the air shifted. A new presence stepped forward. A tall, quiet force who had been watching the entire time. Shaquille O'Neal had been standing just a few feet away, listening, observing. His face unreadable, his massive frame impossible to ignore. Richard, too absorbed in his own performance, hadn't noticed him before. But now, as the towering figure moved closer, something in Richard's posture stiffened. Shaq tilted his head slightly. "Something wrong here?" Richard blinked, his composure faltering for the first time. "Excuse me?" Shaq didn't blink. "I asked if something's wrong. 'Cause from where I'm standing, looks like a loyal customer is being given a hard time over her own money." Martha turned slightly, her eyes filled with something unreadable. She hadn't asked for help, but she wasn't about to refuse it either. Richard let out a forced chuckle, his bravado wobbling. "Sir, this is just standard procedure. Nothing personal." Shaq took a step closer, his presence alone making Richard shift back an inch. "Funny," he said, voice smooth but heavy. "'Cause it sure sounds personal." The bank was silent. The audience that had been content to stay quiet was now watching closely. Richard cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "Sir, I don't see how this concerns you." Shaq leaned in just slightly, his voice never rising, never threatening, just certain. "I make it my business when I see good people getting treated like they don't belong." Richard swallowed. The smirk that had been so easy minutes ago was gone now, replaced by something closer to discomfort. Again, sir, this is just protocol. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. Then you won't mind explaining the exact protocol that lets you question a woman's financial stability when she's been banking here longer than you've had that desk. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. The room had turned against him. The silent complicity was cracking. And for the first time, Richard Caldwell looked unsure. Shaquille O'Neal had seen enough. He had been standing just a few feet away, watching the entire exchange unfold, his massive frame blending into the background despite its sheer size. He was used to moving through spaces without announcing himself, to letting people show their true colors before revealing who he really was. And today, Richard Caldwell was showing every shade of his arrogance, his bias wrapped neatly in the disguise of protocol. Shaq's fists curled at his sides, not in anger that sought violence, but in frustration at a scene that was all too familiar. It was a reminder of a fight that never seemed to end, of a battle his mother had warned him about since he was a child. The way Richard's voice carried across the bank, belittling Martha. The way no one had stepped forward to challenge him. It all felt like a script that had played out too many times before. He scanned the room, taking in the different reactions. A middle-aged white man in a suit checked his phone, deliberately ignoring the scene unfolding in front of him. A younger woman in yoga pants shifted uncomfortably but said nothing, her eyes darting between Martha and Richard, wanting to intervene but not wanting to involve herself. An older man, dressed in overalls, looked on with what could only be described as mild amusement, as if he had seen this happen before and didn't expect it to change. But then there were the bank tellers, frozen at their stations, trapped between their jobs and their morals. Lisa, the young woman who had initially tried to help Martha, kept her head down, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter as if bracing herself. She wasn't okay with this, but she also wasn't ready to lose her job over it. And then there was the security guard, a black man in his late 40s, standing by the door, jaw tight, eyes locked on the scene. His hands were clasped in front of him, the way a man clenches his fists without making it obvious. He wasn't enjoying this, but he also wasn't going to make the first move. Shaq exhaled slowly. He had waited long enough. Taking a step forward, he made his presence known. "You got a real interesting way of treating your customers," he said, his voice even, calm, but carrying enough weight to make the room take notice. Richard turned, his smirk still intact. "Excuse me?" Shaq crossed his arms, his eyes locked onto Richard's with quiet intensity. "I said, the way you're talking to this woman, it's interesting." Richard gave him a once-over, his smirk widening. He didn't recognize him. Or maybe he did and was pretending not to. Either way, his arrogance remained intact. "This doesn't concern you," Richard said smoothly. "It's a private banking matter." Shaq tilted his head slightly, letting the moment stretch. "That right?" Richard nodded. "That's right, standard procedure, fraud prevention." Shaq let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "You keep saying that like it means something." Richard's smile flickered. "It does mean something. We have policies." Shaq took another step closer, the atmosphere shifting with him. "And these policies, do they apply to everyone, or just certain people?" The question landed heavy in the air. A few people glanced up, watching closely now. Even Lisa, who had kept her head down, flicked her gaze toward Shaq. Richard scoffed, his smirk returning. "Sir, I don't appreciate whatever you're insinuating." Shaq didn't blink. "I'm not insinuating anything. I'm asking a simple question. Do you question every customer like this or just the ones that look like her?" Martha, standing just behind Shaq, inhaled sharply. She wasn't sure whether to step in or let this play out. But something about the way Shaq spoke, measured, controlled, but unshakable, told her to wait. Richard's jaw tightened for the first time. "I don't like your tone." Shaq let a small smile play on his lips, but there was no humor in it. "You're not supposed to." The bank was dead silent now. Even the man in the suit had put his phone away, sensing that this moment wasn't one to ignore. Richard straightened his tie, glancing around as if trying to regain control. "Sir, I don't know who you think you are, but..." Shaq raised a brow. "That's the thing. You don't know who I am. but you didn't need to know me to dismiss me the second I spoke up. Richard opened his mouth, but Shaq didn't let him interrupt. And you definitely didn't need to know Martha to assume she couldn't handle her own money. His voice never rose, but the power in it filled the space, making it impossible to ignore. You looked at her, and you made up your mind before she even said a word. Richard chuckled, but it was forced now. You're twisting this into something it's not. Shaq tilted his head again. Am I? The silence that followed said otherwise. Richard's confidence wavered just enough for Shaq to press forward. He nodded toward the tellers. Tell me something. Has anyone else had their identity questioned today? Nobody answered. Shaq looked at Lisa, his expression gentle but expectant. How many times have you seen this happen? Lisa's throat bobbed as she swallowed hard. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. The look in her eyes was enough. Richard noticed the shift, and his irritation flared. All right, that's enough. He turned back to Martha, his tone clipped. Mrs. Williams, if you'd like to come back another day. She's not coming back another day, Shaq interrupted smoothly. She's leaving here with her money. Today. Richard's lips parted slightly, as if stunned by the audacity of being challenged so openly. He glanced at the security guard, but the man didn't move. If anything, his stance seemed to relax, as if he was just as interested in how this would end as everyone else. Richard's frustration was unraveling now, his composure slipping in small but noticeable ways. I don't have to explain myself to you, he snapped. Shaq nodded slowly. No, you don't. He took a step back, tilting his head toward the other customers. But maybe you should explain yourself to them. Richard blinked. Shaq gestured around. Because from where I'm standing, you just made a whole lot of people uncomfortable. You just showed them what kind of place this is. His voice dipped lower, deliberate. And something tells me that's not good for business. The shift in power was palpable. Richard had started this exchange believing he had control. Now, with the weight of the room against him, he was realizing just how little he actually had. Martha stepped forward, her voice steady. Am I getting my money or not? Richard's mouth opened and closed, his confidence shattered. The bank was waiting, watching. And in that moment, the balance of power had tipped. A heavy silence hung over the bank, thick with unspoken tension. The balance of power had shifted, but Shaq knew the game wasn't over yet. Richard Caldwell stood stiffly behind the counter, his confidence rattled, but not completely broken. He still had the title, the authority, the ability to deny Martha her money with a single keystroke. But what he didn't have anymore was the comfort of knowing no one was watching. Shaq had made sure of that. Martha stood tall beside him, her presence a quiet but undeniable force. The bank tellers glanced between one another, as if debating whether now was the time to speak up. The customers remained still, their curiosity morphing into something deeper, something dangerously close to awareness. Shaq wasn't done yet. His eyes flickered around the room, taking in details he had overlooked before. The way an elderly black man sat near the entrance, his number slip crumpled in his fist, waiting far longer than he should have been. The way a young black woman in a business suit stood near the loan officer's desk, her brows furrowed as she repeatedly checked the time, ignored while others had been called before her. The subtle but undeniable pattern of who was being served quickly and who was being forced to wait. This wasn't just about Martha. This was bigger, and that was when he heard it. A low voice, barely more than a whisper. This isn't new. Shaq turned slightly, eyes landing on a young black man standing near the ATM. He looked to be in his mid-20s, dressed in a button-down shirt and slacks, his jaw tight with restrained anger. His gaze flicked to Richard, then back to Shaq. He does this all the time. Shaq's expression didn't change, but something in his chest tightened. He took a step closer to the young man, keeping his voice low. You know this for a fact? The young man nodded subtly. Name's Jordan. Been banking here for a couple of years. Thought maybe it was just me, but then I started paying attention. Noticed the same thing happening to my aunt, my friends, my co-workers. His lips pressed together. Same excuses, different faces. Shaq didn't respond immediately. He let the weight of Jordan's words settle. He had spent his life around people who looked for patterns, coaches who studied plays, analysts who broke down statistics. And what he had just witnessed wasn't random. It was systemic. He turned his attention back to Richard, who was now pretending to sift through paperwork, avoiding eye contact. A man grasping at the last threads of control. Shaq wasn't going to let him get away that easily. He took a deliberate step forward. "So, tell me, Richard." His voice was smooth, casual, but carried an edge that couldn't be ignored. "What's the usual wait time for a withdrawal like this?" Richard's eyes snapped up, and for the first time there was something close to panic behind them. "Excuse me?" Shaq gestured toward the bank lobby, where several black customers still sat waiting. "I'm just curious. How long does the average customer wait for service here?" Richard forced a chuckle, but it landed awkwardly. "It depends on the transaction." Shaq nodded slowly, as if considering that. "And tell me, why is it that some people get through quicker than others? Same type of transactions. Same bank. Different results." Richard's face flushed. "That's ridiculous." Shaq smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Is it?" He could feel the energy in the room shift again. The quiet murmurs of customers, the subtle but undeniable realization that this was more than just one bad interaction. It was a pattern, a culture, a system designed to make some people feel unwelcome in a place that was supposed to serve them equally. Richard straightened his tie, his frustration morphing into defiance. "Sir, I don't know what you're trying to suggest, but we follow strict policies here. Race has nothing to do with it." Shaq tilted his head. "Did I say anything about race?" The question hung between them, thick with implication. Richard's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. He had walked straight into the trap. Jordan stepped forward, his voice steady. "Then explain why every black customer in this bank is still waiting while the others have been helped." Lisa, the young teller who had tried to help Martha earlier, sucked in a breath. Her fingers curled against the counter, her internal battle playing out in real time. Shaq could see it in her eyes, the fear of losing her job, but also the growing inability to stay silent. Finally, she spoke. I've noticed it too." Her voice was small, hesitant, but powerful in its honesty. Richard's head snapped toward her. "Lisa, I'm sorry, Mr. Caldwell, but it's true." Her voice grew stronger. "I've been working here long enough to see the pattern." She glanced at the other tellers, as if silently asking for backup. One of them, a young man in his 30s, nodded slightly but didn't speak. Another lowered her gaze, unwilling to pick a side just yet. Shaq turned back to Richard. "You were saying?" Richard's composure was unraveling. His hands clenched, his face a shade too red. "I don't have to stand here and justify our policies to you," he spat. "If you have an issue, take it up with corporate." Shaq's smile returned, slow and knowing. "Oh, don't worry, I will." A ripple of energy spread through the room, an unspoken promise that this wasn't ending here. Shaq wasn't just another frustrated customer. He wasn't someone Richard could brush off. And Richard was starting to realize it. The security guard near the door took a slow step forward, not in aggression, but in quiet curiosity. It was clear he had been waiting to see how this would play out. Martha, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "I've been coming here for years, never once bounced a check, never once caused trouble. And yet today I'm treated like a criminal for asking for my own money." She turned to the crowd, her voice unwavering. "How many of you have been treated the same way?" A few hesitant hands went up, and then more. Shaq turned, meeting the eyes of each person who had silently endured what Martha had. "No more," he said, his voice firm but filled with something deeper. "Not today." Richard scoffed, but it lacked its usual confidence. He glanced around, realizing the tide was turning against him. "You people always look for something to be offended about." A collective inhale spread through the bank. Even those who had stayed neutral stiffened at the words. Shaq didn't react immediately. He let the silence work for him. Let Richard's own words linger in the air like a foul stench. Then, finally, he chuckled. A low, knowing sound that made Richard's jaw tighten. "That's the best you got?" Shaq shook his head. See? That's the problem. You don't even realize how deep this goes. He glanced at Jordan, then at Martha, then at the hands still raised in quiet solidarity. You thought today was just another day, Shaq continued, his voice smooth but unshakable. Another moment where you could get away with it. But here's the thing about patterns. His gaze locked onto Richard's. They only stay hidden until someone decides to expose them. Richard's throat bobbed. He could feel it now. The loss of control. The room wasn't his anymore. And Shaq was just getting started. Shaq could see it in the way Richard's fingers twitched against the desk, the way his gaze darted toward the security guard, toward the exit, toward anything that could offer him a way out. But there was no way out. Not today. Shaq exhaled, slow and controlled, before finally letting the moment stretch just long enough for Richard to feel it. And then, he said the words that shattered the last illusion Richard had left. My name is Shaquille O'Neal. Silence. Complete. Utter. Silence. The air itself seemed to shift, as if the walls of the bank had absorbed the weight of what had just been said. Richard's face paled, his lips parting slightly as if trying to process what he had just heard. A few gasps rippled through the room, followed by the subtle movement of people shifting in their seats, suddenly realizing they were in the middle of something far bigger than they had expected. A woman near the back whispered, "Wait. Shaq? Like Shaq? The realization spread through the bank like wildfire. Someone fumbled with their phone, likely pulling up Google just to be sure. Others murmured in hushed tones, their previous silence now replaced with an electric buzz of recognition. But the only reaction Shaq was watching was Richard's. The bank manager's throat bobbed as he forced himself to laugh, the sound strained and brittle. "Oh, well, Mr. O'Neal, I didn't realize..." Shaq raised a hand, cutting him off. "That's the thing, Richard." His voice was steady, deliberate. "You did realize. You just didn't care." Richard blinked rapidly. "Now hold on just a minute, sir. I think there's been some sort of..." "No," Shaq interrupted, shaking his head. "No more excuses. No more backpedaling. I want you to listen. Really listen. Because what happened here today..." His gaze swept across the room, locking eyes with customers, tellers, and even the security guard. This wasn't an accident. Richard let out a breathless chuckle, his desperation slipping through the cracks. "Look, I already told you, this is standard policy. It has nothing to do with..." "With what?" Shaq stepped closer, his sheer presence enough to make Richard shrink slightly. "Race? Bias? A pattern of treating black customers like they don't belong?" His voice never rose, but the authority in it made every syllable feel like a hammer striking steel. "Because I've been standing here long enough to see the truth." He turned, gesturing toward the customers still waiting in the lobby. "And I'm not the only one." A murmur rippled through the crowd. For the first time, people weren't just watching, they were participating. A young black woman near the loan officer's desk stepped forward. "He's right," she said, her voice clear despite the nerves she tried to mask. "I've been waiting here for over an hour. They told me they were still reviewing my application, but I saw 3 people go in before me. 3 white people." Another voice joined in, an older black man near the entrance. "I came in just to cash a check. Been sitting here damn near 30 minutes. Ain't never taken that long before." Jordan, the young man who had spoken to Shaq earlier, stepped forward. "I told you," he said, looking at Richard now. "You've been getting away with this for too long." Richard's face was losing color fast. He held up a hand, trying to salvage what was left of his authority. All right. Everyone, calm down. This is all just a big misunderstanding." Shaq folded his arms. "Is it?" Richard's jaw tightened. "Yes," he said, voice sharp now. "You're all twisting this into something it's not. I run a professional institution, and I will not be accused of discrimination just because a few customers are upset over wait times." Shaq nodded slowly, letting the words settle before delivering the final blow. "Then why did you single out Martha?" The bank fell silent again. Richard flinched. "I didn't..." "Yes, you did," Shaq cut in. "You questioned her ability to handle her own money. You treated her like she didn't belong here, like she had to prove she deserved access to what was already hers." He shook his head. "You humiliated her, in front of everyone." Martha, who had been standing quietly all this time, finally spoke. Her voice was soft, but it carried a weight that made it impossible to ignore. "Do you know how tired I am of this?" Shaq turned to her, watching as she stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly. Not with fear, but with the exhaustion of someone who had carried this burden for too long. Martha looked at Richard directly. "I've lived through worse than you. I've walked into places where I wasn't wanted, sat in waiting rooms where I was ignored, been made to feel like I was invisible." She swallowed. "But I am not invisible." Richard said nothing. He couldn't. Martha inhaled sharply before continuing. "I deposited my first paycheck in this bank over 20 years ago. I raised my children, my grandchildren, and I taught them the value of hard work. And yet, after all these years, I still walk into a place like this and get treated like I don't belong." She exhaled, the weight of decades pressing against her ribs. "Tell me, Richard, what more do I have to do?" The room was still now. No one dared to move. Richard's mouth opened, but no sound came out. For the first time, the man who had always held the power in this space had no words. Shaq stepped beside Martha, his presence unwavering. "She's not asking for a favor," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "She's asking for the respect she's owed." Richard's lips pressed into a thin line. A phone chimed, and then another. People started glancing at their screens, their faces shifting from curiosity to realization. Someone near the back murmured, "It's already online." Shaq's eyes flickered toward the sound. He wasn't surprised. People had been recording. This moment, this exposure, was already spreading beyond the walls of this bank. And Richard knew it. The man's hands trembled slightly as he straightened his tie, glancing toward the cameras that had been quietly documenting his downfall. His bravado was gone. His control shattered. Shaq let the silence stretch, let Richard sit in the weight of what he had done. Then, after a long pause, he asked one final question. "Martha," he said, his tone softer now, "do you want to take your money and go?" Martha didn't hesitate. "Yes." Shaq nodded once before turning back to Richard. "Then I suggest you process her transaction." Richard looked like he wanted to argue, to fight back, to reclaim some piece of his slipping power. But there was nothing left to grab. His hands moved to the keyboard, fingers stiff as he began to type. Martha exhaled slowly. Shaq didn't move. The moment of reckoning had come. And Richard Caldwell? He had already lost. The rhythmic clicking of Richard's keyboard was the only sound breaking the silence as he processed Martha's withdrawal. His hands trembled slightly, his jaw tight with humiliation. The weight of the room, the judgment in every pair of eyes locked onto him, was suffocating. This was a moment he had never expected, a moment where the power he had wielded so effortlessly was no longer his to control. Martha stood firm beside Shaq, her chin high, her dignity unshaken. The transaction should have taken minutes, yet Richard dragged it out as long as he could, clinging to what little authority remained. Then, the bank's glass doors swung open. A tall, suited man strode inside, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. His sharp eyes scanned the room, landing immediately on the commotion at the counter. His neatly combed salt and pepper hair and tailored gray suit marked him as someone important. He moved with a practiced air of control, the kind of man who was used to cleaning up messes before they spiraled. John Whitaker, regional manager of the bank. A low murmur spread through the crowd. The employees straightened instinctively, like soldiers at attention. Even Richard, who had once worn his arrogance like a shield, stiffened at the sight of his superior. John's voice was smooth, professional, but carried an edge. "What's going on here?" Richard cleared his throat, regaining enough of himself to put on his best damage control face. "Mr. Whitaker, there was just a slight misunderstanding. I was handling it." John's gaze flicked toward Shaq, then to the tellers, the customers, and finally to the phone still recording. His expression barely shifted, but Shaq caught it. That slight tightening around the eyes, the calculation happening behind them. John Whitaker was a man who understood optics, and right now, they were working against him. Shaq didn't wait for Richard to spin his version of the story. He stepped forward, his voice steady. "Handling it?" His eyes locked onto John's. I'd love to hear how denying a longtime customer her own money, questioning her financial stability, and publicly humiliating her falls under handling it. A ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. Richard's face twitched, his discomfort growing. John's expression remained neutral. I'm sure there's an explanation for this. Shaq nodded. There is? He turned to the crowd. And plenty of witnesses, too. John hesitated just long enough for Shaq to push forward. I've been standing here for the past 30 minutes, Shaq continued, his tone firm but controlled. And I've seen a pattern. Black customers being made to wait longer, transactions delayed, applications stalled, and when someone finally speaks up, he gestured toward Martha. They're treated like criminals instead of respected customers. John shifted his weight, adjusting his suit jacket. Mr. O'Neal. Shaq didn't let him finish. And before you say this is just about procedure, I want you to look around. John followed Shaq's gaze, scanning the waiting area. The pattern was undeniable now. Black customers still sat with their number slips, some clutching paperwork they had likely submitted hours ago. Meanwhile, white customers had come and gone, their business handled with ease. Shaq's voice dropped just slightly, enough to make the moment heavier. You want to explain that? John's jaw clenched, a flicker of unease crossing his polished exterior. He glanced at Richard, then at the tellers, as if expecting someone to step in, to refute the claim. But no one did. Instead, Lisa, the young teller, finally spoke. I've seen it too, she said, voice quiet but clear. It's not just today. Richard shot her a look, but Lisa didn't shrink back this time. It happens all the time, she said, her voice gaining confidence. I don't think we mean to at first, but then Richard starts questioning certain customers more, asking for extra verification, making them wait. It's not official policy, but... Her voice trailed off. The damage was already done. Shaq folded his arms. So, John, he said, letting the words sink in. Still just a misunderstanding. John exhaled slowly. He was trapped, and he knew it. With Shaq's presence, the growing number of witnesses, and the very real possibility that this could explode beyond the walls of the bank, he had to tread carefully. He straightened his tie, his voice even. I understand how this looks. Shaq arched a brow. How it looks. John hesitated. And if there have been oversights in our customer service, we'll investigate and correct them immediately. His tone was rehearsed, corporate smooth. He turned toward Martha. Mrs. Williams, on behalf of this institution, I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience you've experienced today. Martha's expression didn't soften. She wasn't interested in hollow words. Shaq saw through it too. He took another step forward, his towering frame making the regional manager appear smaller in comparison. An apology doesn't fix a broken system. John met his gaze, trying to match Shaq's steadiness but failing. We take these matters seriously. Shaq let out a quiet chuckle. No, you take bad press seriously. If I weren't here, if half this bank weren't recording, would you still be standing here? Would you still be promising to investigate? John hesitated, but it was enough of an answer. Shaq nodded. That's what I thought. The weight of the moment pressed down hard. The bank was no longer just a place of business. It was a battleground. A moment that would either fade away into empty apologies or spark real consequences. John inhaled sharply, realizing there was only one move left to make. His gaze flicked to Richard. Mr. Caldwell, he said, his voice carefully measured. I think it's best if you step away from your position while we conduct an internal review. Richard's face drained of color. What? Shaq watched as panic spread across the manager's features. The arrogance, the control, the easy smirks. All gone now. John continued, keeping his tone cool. Given the circumstances, we can't ignore the claims being made here. Until we investigate, you'll be placed on temporary leave. Richard took a step forward. You can't be serious. You're just going to throw me under the bus because he walked in? He gestured toward Shaq with wild frustration. Do you have any idea what this will do to my reputation? Shaq exhaled through his nose. You should have thought about that before you decided to make Martha's dignity your personal plaything. Richard's mouth opened, but no words came. John adjusted his tie once more, turning back toward Shaq. "We'll issue a formal statement later today, acknowledging the concerns raised here." His voice was smoother now, as if shifting back into corporate control. "And I assure you, this bank will take the appropriate steps to ensure every customer receives the same level of service moving forward." Shaq didn't smile. He knew men like John, damage control specialists, the kind who could clean up a mess without ever actually fixing it. But today, they weren't getting away with a simple PR move. Shaq turned to the crowd. "This isn't just about today. It's not just about one manager making bad calls. It's about how we let this keep happening." He met the eyes of the waiting customers, the bank employees, even the security guard. "We all see it. We all know it. But knowing isn't enough. It stops when we stop accepting it." A quiet but undeniable agreement rippled through the room. John cleared his throat. "If you'd like to discuss further ways we can improve." Shaq cut him off. "Oh, we'll be discussing it." His eyes locked onto the regional managers. "Publicly." John didn't respond. He didn't need to, because this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The moment Richard Caldwell was placed on leave, the dam broke. It started small, just a few beeps and vibrations as customers checked their phones. The first video had already been uploaded. A shaky but clear clip captured the exact moment Shaq exposed Richard's pattern of discrimination. Another showed Martha standing firm, refusing to be dismissed. Someone had caught Richard's panicked expression as John Whitaker, the regional manager, removed him from his position. Within minutes, the bank transformed from a tense battleground into something else entirely. A news story in real time. Shaq stood near the counter, his arms crossed as he watched it unfold. He had seen power shift before, but this was something different. This was the kind of reckoning that couldn't be swept under a rug. Then the first notification popped up. "Justice for Martha," one post. Then another, and another. Within 15 minutes, the hashtag was trending. Lisa, the young teller who had bravely spoken out, stared at her screen in disbelief. "It's everywhere," she whispered. "People are tagging news stations, journalists, even the bank's corporate office." Shaq wasn't surprised. He had seen how quickly the internet could rally behind injustice. But this wasn't just about Martha. This was about all the people who had been mistreated in places just like this, where discrimination hid behind policy, and power was weaponized against those who didn't have it. The glass doors swung open again. This time, it wasn't just one person. It was a camera crew. A young reporter in a navy blazer, microphone in hand, pushed through the gathered customers, her cameraman right behind her. She barely took a second to assess the scene before locking eyes with Shaq. "Mr. O'Neal," she called, her voice steady but urgent. "Can we get a statement?" Richard, who had been frozen near the manager's desk, spun toward her like a drowning man spotting a lifeboat. He straightened his tie and tried to regain some control. Yes, I can explain the situation." The reporter walked right past him. Richard blinked, stunned, as she stopped directly in front of Shaq. "Mr. O'Neal," she repeated, microphone extended. "Can you tell us what happened here today?" Shaq took a breath, choosing his words carefully. He wasn't just speaking for himself. "This isn't just about today," he said, his voice measured. "And it's not just about this bank. What happened here is something that happens all the time, all over the country. It's a pattern, a system that makes it harder for people like Martha Williams to get what's already theirs." He let his gaze sweep across the room. This time it got caught on camera, but how many times does it happen when no one's watching? The reporter nodded, absorbing every word. "And what do you say to those who argue this was just a misunderstanding?" Shaq's jaw tightened. "A misunderstanding?" He gestured toward Martha, who stood dignified but visibly drained from the ordeal. "Tell me, does she look confused? Does she look like someone who misunderstood being denied her own money?" Martha, silent until now, stepped forward. "I've been banking here for over 20 years, she said, her voice soft but firm. "But today, I was treated like a stranger, like I wasn't welcome. And I know I'm not the only one." She turned to the camera, her eyes full of a quiet strength. "If I had walked out without making a scene, nothing would have changed. But today, someone stood up for me. And because of that, maybe tomorrow will be different. The reporter looked back at Shaq. And what do you want to see happen next? Shaq didn't hesitate. Accountability. The reporter nodded. Thank you, Mr. O'Neal. She turned to face the camera. As you can see, today's events have sparked a much larger conversation about discrimination in banking institutions. And with the story already going viral, the question now is, will this be the moment that forces real change? As she wrapped up her report, the cameraman panned across the bank, capturing the tense but shifting energy in the room. But Richard Caldwell wasn't done fighting. He turned to John Whitaker, desperation creeping into his voice. You can't just let them spin this narrative, he hissed, lowering his voice in a last-ditch effort to salvage himself. This is bad for all of us. John exhaled through his nose, his face unreadable. You did this to yourself. Richard scoffed. Oh, come on. You think they're going to stop at me? The second corporate sees those videos, they'll come for you next. John hesitated just long enough for Shaq to catch it. The regional manager wasn't worried about Richard anymore. He was worried about himself. About how high up this would go, about how much corporate would be willing to sacrifice to protect their reputation. And Shaq wanted him to feel that. Because this wasn't going away. Not with a quiet suspension. Not with an empty apology. This wasn't just a PR problem. This was a reckoning. A new voice cut through the noise. The CEO just issued a statement. All heads turned toward Jordan, the young man who had first whispered the truth to Shaq. He held up his phone, the official tweet displayed on the screen. We are aware of the incident that occurred today at one of our branches. We take these matters very seriously and are conducting a full investigation into the allegations of discriminatory practices. We are committed to ensuring all customers receive equal treatment, and we will take appropriate action. A low murmur spread through the bank. Some people scoffed, others nodded in approval. Shaq's expression remained unreadable. He had seen statements like this before, carefully worded, vague enough to avoid legal responsibility, but just strong enough to calm the outrage. But this time, words weren't enough. This isn't over, Shaq said, his voice low but firm. Jordan nodded, understanding. Not even close. Outside, more cameras had gathered. News vans were pulling up, reporters stepping out, adjusting their microphones, preparing for their live shots. The story was no longer just inside these walls. It was everywhere. The next morning, the bank was all over the news. Every major network ran the footage. Richard Caldwell's smugness turning into panic. Shaq's quiet but unshakable confrontation. Martha's dignified resilience. The world had watched as an ordinary day at a small-town bank unraveled into something much bigger. The bank's headquarters, facing mounting pressure, had no choice but to respond. Breaking news. Bank manager suspended pending investigation. A corporate-issued press release followed, carefully worded but unmistakably serious. We do not tolerate discrimination in any form. The manager involved has been placed on immediate suspension, and we are conducting a thorough internal review of our branch policies. Moving forward, we are committed to ensuring every customer is treated with fairness and respect. It was the kind of statement designed to control damage, but Shaq knew better. Words were easy, action was harder, and the people weren't going to let this fade. By noon, a crowd had gathered outside the bank. What started as curiosity had turned into something more, a demand for change. Signs reading, "Equal banking for all," and "Dignity over discrimination," waved in the air. Local activists, church leaders, and everyday citizens took turns speaking on makeshift podiums, calling for transparency, accountability, and real policy shifts. The energy was electric, fueled by something deeper than just outrage. This was a community recognizing its power. Inside the bank, the tension had shifted. Employees moved with an uneasy quiet, whispering about the corporate emails that had flooded their inboxes, emergency meetings, policy reviews, mandated diversity training. The atmosphere, once controlled by silent complicity, was now thick with reckoning. John Whitaker, the regional manager, sat stiffly in the branch office, scrolling through news articles, knowing full well that his own role in all this wasn't forgotten. His job, his reputation, his standing in the company, none of it felt as secure as it had 24 hours ago. Richard, however, had already lost everything. His name was plastered across headlines, his face frozen in viral video thumbnails, a symbol of everything wrong with the system. His suspension was just the beginning. Corporate needed a scapegoat, and he had made it all too easy for them. Yet, as satisfying as it was to see justice catch up to him, Shaq wasn't here for Richard. He was here for Martha. Shaq found her sitting outside the bank, away from the cameras and the crowd, her hands resting in her lap. She looked out at the street, watching the people who had once sat in silence now raising their voices. Shaq took a seat beside her. "You okay?" Martha exhaled softly. "I think so." She turned to him, her eyes filled with something deeper than gratitude, something heavier. "I never expected any of this." Shaq smiled, but his voice was serious. "You shouldn't have had to expect it. You should have walked in, done your business, and gone home." Martha nodded slowly. "But that's not the world we live in, is it?" Shaq looked out at the street, at the people demanding better. "Maybe it can be." She studied him for a long moment before her lips pressed together in a small, knowing smile. "You remind me of my son," she said. "Always standing up for folks, always believing things can change." Shaq chuckled. "Sounds like a smart man." Martha's eyes glistened as she reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "Thank you, Shaquille. Not just for me, for all of us." He nodded, squeezing back. "Anytime." By evening, the bank's headquarters released a second statement, this time with real action attached. New anti-discrimination measures implemented immediately. They laid out concrete steps: mandatory bias training for all employees, a customer complaint review board to track discrimination claims, a commitment to diversifying leadership roles within the company, a direct hotline for reporting unfair banking practices. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it was a start. And it wouldn't have happened without the public outcry, without the viral videos, without a community refusing to let the moment pass. As Shaq sat in his hotel room later that night, watching the news cycle through footage of the protests, of Martha's strength, of the bank scrambling to fix what had been exposed, he exhaled deeply. He hadn't planned on stepping into a fight that day, but sometimes the fight found you. And when it did, you had two choices: stay silent or stand up. Shaq had made his choice, and this time, the world had listened. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting warm hues over the quiet neighborhood as Shaq pulled up to his mother's house. The chaos of the last 24 hours felt like a distant storm, but its echoes lingered. The fight wasn't over, but for now, he was home. Lucille O'Neal opened the door before he even knocked. "Boy, I saw you on every channel." Her voice was both proud and exasperated. "You done gone and flipped a whole bank upside down." Shaq chuckled, stepping inside. "Wasn't the plan, Ma." She studied his face, reading the weight behind his smile. "But it needed to happen." He exhaled, nodding. "Yeah, it did." Lucille led him to the kitchen, where the smell of freshly brewed tea filled the air. She poured him a cup, sliding it across the table as she sat down across from him. "Tell me everything." Shaq leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "It started with Martha," he said. "She just wanted to withdraw her money, and that manager, Richard, treated her like she didn't belong." His voice tightened. "Like she was a problem instead of a customer." Lucille shook her head, her expression unreadable. "I know that feeling." Shaq met her eyes. He didn't need to ask what she meant. "I've been in her shoes," she continued. "Not just in a bank, but in stores, restaurants, workplaces, having to prove I deserve to be somewhere even when I know I do." Her fingers tapped against the table. "It's exhausting." Shaq nodded. "That's what hit me the most, Ma." She wasn't even surprised, just tired. He shook his head. "And if I hadn't been there? If she'd walked out and let it go?" Lucille sighed. "Then nothing would have changed." Shaq stared into his tea, the warmth doing little to loosen the tightness in his chest. "They suspended Richard, launched an investigation, promised reforms. He let out a humorless chuckle. We've heard those promises before. Lucille arched a brow. And what are you going to do about it? Shaq sat forward. Punishing Richard isn't enough. Firing one man doesn't fix a broken system. Lucille nodded approvingly. Go on. Shaq tapped his fingers against the table, organizing his thoughts. The real problem is the culture in these banks, the unspoken rules about who gets treated with respect and who doesn't. That's not going to change with a press release. Lucille smiled knowingly. You already got a plan, don't you? Shaq smirked. Working on it. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through the flood of messages he'd received. Activists, community leaders, even banking executives reaching out after the story exploded. People are paying attention. I'm going to make sure this moment turns into something real. Lucille took a sip of her tea, nodding. So what's next? Shaq exhaled. First, I'm meeting with some folks about mandatory diversity training in banking. Not just a one-time seminar, but real, ongoing education. He leaned forward. Bias training. Financial literacy programs in underserved communities. Changing the hiring process to bring in more Black executives. Making sure bank policies actually work for everyone. Lucille beamed. That's my boy. Shaq chuckled. You raised me right. Before heading back to his hotel, Shaq made one last stop. Martha's house was small but well kept, the front porch lined with potted plants. When she opened the door, her eyes widened in surprise. Shaquille, what are you doing here? He smiled. Just wanted to check on you. Martha shook her head, laughing as she ushered him inside. I should be checking on you. You've been busy. Shaq glanced around the cozy living room, photos of her family lining the walls. You holding up okay? She nodded, but her voice was softer. I am now. They sat together, the weight of the past day still lingering between them. I saw the news, she said. The bank's making changes, because of you. Shaq shook his head. Because of us. You spoke up. The people in that bank spoke up. I just made sure people heard. Martha studied him for a moment, then reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. You gave me my dignity back. Shaq's throat tightened. You never lost it, Martha. They just forgot to see it. She smiled, eyes shining. Promise me something? Anything. Don't stop fighting. Shaq nodded. I won't. Later that night, Shaq stepped out onto the quiet street, the air cool against his skin. The world was still buzzing with the events of the past day, but in this moment, everything was still. He had walked into that bank as a customer. He had walked out as something more. Not as a celebrity, not as an athlete, but as a man who had stood up when it mattered. And that was worth more than any championship ring. This isn't just a story, it's a reality too many still face. Discrimination doesn't end with one viral moment. It ends when we refuse to stay silent, when we demand better, when we turn outrage into action. Today, it was Martha. Tomorrow, it could be someone you love. So ask yourself, when the moment comes, will you stand up or look away?